Hello class, welcome to Supply and Demand Lesson 2. This lesson is on the determinants of supply and demand curves. These are the things that cause a supply and demand curve to move. Remember, in Lesson 1, I showed you that changes in the price don't move the supply or the demand curve. So the new question is, well, okay, what does move them? We call them determinants. Let's do the determinants of demand curves first. So the short list is, first, changes in income. And you might remember that when income goes up, normally people buy more of a thing, but there are some cases, there are some goods where when your income goes up, you choose to buy less of it. Things that you would normally buy when you're trying to save money, but when your income goes up, maybe you don't care to do that quite so much. So there are normal and inferior goods, and all we can say with certainty is that when income changes, the demand curve moves. It may increase or it may decrease. The second one is changes in the price of a substitute, and there are obvious and non-obvious substitutes, and I have a separate slide for that because textbooks just focus on obvious substitutes. They never really discuss this. Third are changes in the price of a complement. Complements are two things that you might use together. An obvious complement would be like hot dogs and hamburgers. But there are less obvious complements like gasoline and tires, computers and computer software, and so forth. To be complementary, it just means that they are two things that you use together. Then changes in taste and preferences is an obvious one. You might just change your mind about how much you like a thing, and that would move the demand curve. And finally, we have this one called expectations. That is, what you think is going to happen in the future will affect your decision to buy a thing today. Now obviously there are many other things that can move a demand curve. They're just not in the short list. One good example would be if you're selling umbrellas or raincoats, for example, and it rains a lot, that would increase the demand curve for your product. So the weather would be down here, but it doesn't make the short list that most textbooks list. Okay, so what about the determinants of supply curves? So the first one is changes in technology. As technology moves forward, it gets easier to produce things, and that causes the supply curves to shift out to the right. Secondly is changes in the cost of inputs, including taxes. So some inputs are things that we can all readily list, like the cost of labor, the cost of raw materials, the cost of energy, the cost of transportation. But there's also taxes, and it's a simple way and a straightforward way to think about taxes as just another cost of doing business. Then there's changes in opportunity cost. I have a separate slide for this. Opportunity cost is defined to be whatever it is that you have to give up by choosing to do one thing instead of something else. And then finally, again, expectations. What producers think is going to happen in the future will affect their decision to bring something to market today. So if you were, for example, a corn farmer and you thought the price of corn would be higher in the future, that is, corn is in a silo, then you might hold your corn back today and take the higher price in the future. On the other hand, if you thought corn prices were going to fall in the future, you might rush to bring your corn to market today. Then of course there are also other things that just don't make the short list. The true list of determinants of supply curves and determinants of demand curves is probably unbounded. So I'm just giving you the very short list. Okay, so here's a closer look at opportunity cost. Imagine this is a farm and it has 4 fields. So this is Farmer Brown's farm, and she plants cotton, soybean, corn, and tomatoes. But let's suppose that something happens to the price of cotton. Imagine that the price of cotton goes up, and it's not just a temporary thing, that everybody understands that the price of cotton is going to be higher for several planting seasons. What might Farmer Brown do? Well, she's likely to do something like this. She'll take some of her acreage from soybean, tomatoes, and corn so that she can plant more cotton. So the production of cotton, or the quantity supplied of cotton, will go up, but the supply curve for cotton, which is the schedule of all the possible prices of cotton and the corresponding amounts brought to market, that schedule doesn't change, but the supply curves of these other things will all decrease, because even at the old price of corn there will be less corn brought to market, as the land was given over to the production of cotton. You can see it graphically like this. If the price of cotton goes up, then the quantity demanded of cotton will increase. The supply curve for cotton hasn't moved at all, but the supply curve for corn will shift back to the left because there'll be less acreage in corn, and similarly the supply curve for soybean and the supply curve for tomatoes will shift back to the left. Now let's take a closer look at substitutes. Most textbooks will list substitutes as something like this. Hamburgers or a chicken sandwich are two things that you could have for lunch. They are obvious substitutes. What about a raincoat and an umbrella? They are physically very different, but they perform the same function. So maybe, okay, those are also substitutes. What about shoes and sandals? Again, shoes and sandals perform the same function most of the time, but they're really very different. And there's some situations where sandals would be inappropriate. So shoes and sandals aren't substitutes all the time, but sometimes they are. What about a pizza dinner and a movie? Well, if you're really hungry, a movie is not a substitute for a pizza dinner. But if you're looking for something to do on Friday night, a pizza dinner or a movie could be very good substitutes. So these things are kind of different from each other, but I hope you can see that, yeah, in certain situations they could be substitutes. Aluminum and steel. Again, there are certain applications where aluminum and steel are not substitutes, but there are many applications where they are. So they're substitutes some of the time, but not all the time. Here's a really good one. What about jewelry versus a sweater? Well, obviously a jewelry and sweater are two very different things, but if you're looking for a gift to give somebody, it's very possible that you might choose a sweater, or you might choose jewelry or flowers or chocolate or something else, right, if you're looking for a gift. So there are certain situations where they could be substitutes. My favorite is this one. Can a boat be a substitute for a car? Well, if you don't have a car and you need a car to get to work, or you need a car to pick up the kids from school, then no, a boat can't be a substitute for a car. But if you already have a car and you're just thinking, I would like a newer car, a bigger car, a more fuel efficient car, a faster car, a more comfortable car, a more reliable car, some such thing, while you're sitting there trying to decide whether you want to spend the money to get this new car or this different car, you might think, well, maybe I should just get the car I have cleaned up or repaired a little bit and use the money I saved to buy something else, for example, a boat. What about a Disney vacation and braces for your child? You might be thinking, okay, this summer I'd like to take my family on a Disney vacation, but you discover that your child needs braces. You might decide to forego the Disney vacation for a year or two and instead use the money to get braces for your child. So in this situation, those things are substitutes. You could think of it as kind of a continuum. There are obvious substitutes, and there's a whole scale here, and there are non-obvious substitutes. But just because they're not obvious doesn't mean that they aren't truly substitutes for each other. It's important for you to see that, especially if you own your own business. You're constantly trying to figure out who are your competitors. There are your obvious competitors who are producing the same thing as you, but then you also have non-obvious competitors, and it's important to keep your eye on them too. I generally argue like this, that two goods are substitutes if they compete for the same consumer dollar. They don't have to perform the same function or look alike or anything like that. It's just if the consumer is trying to decide between two goods, then those two goods, whatever they are substitutes for each other. Okay, so now how do we show an increase in the demand curve? Well, obviously here's a demand curve. This would be an increase. But I put this slide here because I wanted to warn you about something. Students have a tendency when they write an increase to think of it as a vertical shift up this way, right? And it's okay, I guess, for a demand curve, but it's dangerous to think of it as a vertical shift up. It's much better to think of it as a shift out to the right. The reason for that is because when you look at a supply curve, if you shift the supply curve out to the right, well, that looks like a vertical shift down. So now you've got demand curve shifting up and supply curve shifting down to do the same thing. It's too confusing. It's much, much safer to think of an increase as a shift out to the right, whether it's a demand curve or a supply curve, and a decrease would be a shift back to the left. Okay, that's it. So the next lesson is about finding equilibrium with supply and demand, or what economists call comparative statics, which was invented by this guy Alfred Marshall, who actually, he invented the supply and demand curves too. So that's lesson 3. Okay, I hope you found this helpful.